Welcome to the Right to Reason podcast. I'm your host, Robert Stanley. We were supposed to talk to an Illuminati conspiracy theorist today, but I thought, you know what? I've been digging into people's heads so much lately, sorting out all that crazy stuff that I lost my mission, our focus. I'm not doing conspiracy talk today. No, that's next week. Today, we're talking to Tracie Harris from the Atheist Experience, and we're still breaking up the epistemological earth with the shovel of reason, but we're getting into the meaty source of it all today. She's going to present a talk that will be first released right here on this broadcast, and she needs our help. She needs to condense this, tomb of psychology into a presentation. I'm going to try to be that filter, and you're going to be the audience, the litmus test of truth, as it were. The topic? Religious self-destruction. Tracie's going to delve into identity, questioning your beliefs, sex shaming, distrust of science and truth, and how religion limits your ability to succeed. We're hitting the nail on the head today, and we're digging deep. Are you ready?
He's got old-time religion. It's
the Right to Reason podcast.
And he makes his decisions down on his knees. He's a full-grown man, and
This episode of the Right to Reason podcast is brought to you by our patrons and contributors like me. We have all recognized the value of the unrestrained marketplace of ideas and have decided to make a difference. You can make a difference too. Contribute at patreon.com/right. and learn more about your right to reason at therighttoreason.com. Your activism is appreciated.
give me that old-time religion. Give me that old-time religion. Give me that old-time religion. It's good enough for me.
I am so excited today, ladies and gentlemen. We are talking to Tracie Harris. Tracie, all of my listeners and the majority of the skeptical community knows your name via the Atheist Experience and all of your activist work. But just in case somebody might be listening to this that hasn't heard of you before, where can they find your content, learn more about you, ask you questions, that sort of thing?
Yeah, sure. So the main thing that I work on is, as you say, the Atheist Experience. That is a product that is put out by the Atheist Community of Austin. They put out a lot of content. Some of the other programs that I'm involved in are GB 2.0 or Godless Bitches 2.0, which is a reboot of an older program that I used to be involved in with a little bit of a different cast. That deals with looking at social issues from an atheist feminist paradigm. I've also subbed and helped to host when they need somebody to fill in a slot for the nonprofits, and all of those are products from the Atheist Community of Austin. Less importantly, I guess, or maybe not importantly, but less prominently, I do some public speaking when I'm invited, sometimes conferences, but also small meetups, like a lot of atheist groups have regular lecture series or regular meetings where they sometimes want or use a guest. And so I like to help fill those slots when I can, because we have a lecture coordinator at Atheist Community of Austin, and I know that that can be a tough slot to fill. So when you're trying to find speakers and trying to find people to come and talk to your groups, it can pose a difficulty for the person who's in charge of trying to find people. So I'm always available to sort of help people out with that if they need it. But it's definitely not like my primary role in the community. That is so awesome.
I know anytime somebody calls in and you're hosting on the Atheist Experience, they're about to have their mind blown. Or at a minimum, they're going to have a hard time getting away with trying to throw out logical fallacies or trying to do little tricks. Or my favorite one is probably your least favorite to have to deal with, because the people often come off as real. The callers that fight you on this topic often come off as kind of like a-holes, I've noticed. Mm-hmm. The one that's kind of my favorite is whenever they'll call in and try to be all, get all pro-life on you. And they try to hit you with abortion stuff, and you kind of just wrap it up very neatly each time, and you get right down to simple topics of personhood, personal rights of not just the baby, but, of the mother. And I think a lot of times people forget to look at that. And the reason that they do, it's rarely because they attained a medical degree. It's rarely because they researched it. It's often because of religious indoctrination. And I was hoping to talk to you about that a little bit today and go over a presentation that you put together that is really fantastic. Religious self-destruction.
Right.
Would you be happy to kind of run through this with us and help us understand how
Absolutely.
Indoctrination and identity work together?
And I really, first of all, let me just say that I really appreciate you agreeing to do this. So when you first reached out to me, one of the questions that I ask people when they reach out and say, hey, can you come on my show? Can you come and talk to me? I'm a tough interview because I'm constantly on the air. So people have heard everything I think about everything I think. Anybody that cares or wants to know, it's all out there.
Yeah. So
when someone wants to talk to me, it's actually a big question of mine. What do you want to talk about? Because what are we going to discuss that people haven't heard 1,000 times already?
Right.
And one of the things that I had available was a presentation that I had done in Pennsylvania. I'm happy with the information, but I'm unhappy with the presentation because it's very, very content heavy. And I need something that's more condensed. And so what I threw back to you was, hey, can we go over this so that maybe we can look at, what I'm saying and how I'm trying to say this and what is really the core of this thing that can be condensed down to something more digestible to an audience.
We're going to work on it together.
Because when I gave it in PA, it was super dense. Like you could just see the eyes glazing over in some parts of this thing. And I get it because it's a lot of information and to ask somebody to absorb. It's stuff that I worked on for months. And part of the intensity that I put into this talk had to do with a personal issue that I had that I think a lot of people who are heavily indoctrinated into very conservative styles of religion and very authoritarian styles of religion, they come out of it and after a while, they have to sort of reform themselves. So it's not like believing that your car engine works a certain way and finding out that, oh, this component works a little differently, and that really doesn't affect much else about your life. When you decide, I don't believe in a God and I am rejecting my religion, you're literally throwing out your whole worldview. It's a huge bundle. It's not just like a small thing that you have to adjust for. It's huge. And that means going back through and starting to ask yourself questions about all kinds of things that religion was giving you these simple answers for that you no longer can just turn to a Bible. You now have to really think about it. And it results in you having to sort of build beliefs based on evidence and reason or whatever else you're going to use. Obviously, from my perspective, it was going to be evidence and reason, and that's how I decided to fill that void. Other people might fill the void differently, right? I mean, I guess some people could go into alternative views of like new age stuff or something, or go with their feelings or go with whatever. But in my case, it was having to rebuild and restructure this entire worldview from the wreckage of what was left when I slowly dismantled everything that I believed in. And I'm not the only person that's gone through that, right? Obviously, loads of people in the atheist community have a history with religion that they've gotten out of. And I think a lot of activism comes from people who were indoctrinated into some of the strongest brands of Christianity. So if a person is very humanist perspective on life and they also are a Christian and then they sort of lose their belief in God, I mean, what are they transitioning to? They're transitioning to a more secular based love of humanity, which is just like the love of humanity they had when they were religious. So they're not going to change too much. They're just going to do their things from a slightly different motivation. Whereas somebody who literally was, like raised in a religion where it was, homosexuality is wrong and women have a certain role in family and in life, and people are required to do these certain things. It's very proscriptive of how you behave and not just like, hey, be good to people. So the more liberal religious groups, I think people are less traumatized by that experience. And when they come out of it, they really have less backlash and less of a motivation to want to change themselves and then also maybe reach out and help other people come out of it. So I think the activism is actually fueled by almost a backlash from that kind of indoctrination that you come from. And one of the things that bothered me about it was as I started to come to these beliefs on a secular front, I saw a difference in not just what I believed, but how I believed when I was in religion versus how I believed in things today. And a lot of people struggle with that, not just me. I've heard other people say it. And I remember how that nagged at me, the way, like, how do I explain to people that I had these beliefs before and I have these beliefs now, but it's something different. It's not just that I changed how I believe it. Like in the example I used about your car engine, it's not just like, oh, and then I looked into it and I was wrong about that and the information was this. In that case, you might have believed something that you heard because it was kind of insignificant, or maybe you had read something and misunderstood it. And then later you get a better understanding and you just simply adjust your belief for that. But you still believed it basically for reasons. Whereas indoctrination is kind of different. And what I began to realize when I started to actually build my beliefs based on reason was that how I had reasoned previously was different. And how I had evaluated evidence and how I had come to those views was very different as a religious person than it was as a secular person. And some of the ways that I would express that were unsatisfying and frankly unacceptable. So I would say things like, I believed it, but I didn't really believe it, which is absolutely absurd. I mean, that makes no sense. And yet that's how I was expressing it. And other people would express it similarly. But the problem is I did believe it. And so it wasn't that it wasn't really a belief. It was. I held these things to be true. So it wasn't about whether or not it was a belief. It was something different. It was a different kind of belief. And it was hard to explain that to somebody that hadn't gone through it. It was a different sort of belief. And I had different ways of how I'd come to it. And it had a whole different feel to it, like from an internal perspective than the beliefs that I hold now. And I struggled with not understanding what that difference was. There was a real qualitative difference in me when I would look back at those beliefs and look at the beliefs now. And it was not the same as simply being wrong about something. It was something very different. And so I did a lot of research, and there were times in my life when I would delve into this and I would never really come up with an answer. And then finally I came across something and I said, this speaks to me, this resonates with me, and this explains to me what the qualitative difference was. And not just qualitatively, but it provided models that allowed me to say from a quantifiable perspective, how is this different? Like, can this actually be evaluated to be demonstrated to be a different sort of way of believing? And I think I found that. And so I went ahead and I started digging into the information further and further. I actually had 2 psychiatrists who were extremely helpful to me as sounding boards in coming through this information and giving me tips and leads. And it was interesting because there were a few times they gave me tips to go and look at something, and I would go and look at it and I would think, I don't understand how this is related. And I'd have to look at it again and again and maybe dig deeper. And finally I'd start to realize what it was they were trying to get me to see, because it wasn't immediately understandable to me or immediately recognizable to me. But I finally got through it. And then I put it all in order and I put it all together and I put all my citations, and it goes back decades of psychological models to come to what I eventually was able to say, this is what's different about what I believed then and what I believe now. And I think for people who are in that same struggle of trying to understand that within themselves, this information can be helpful. So it's definitely kind of a limited audience of who it's going to mainly focus on and help. But I think that also it might help some people who have this idea that, oh, you just believed something differently, or you believed it and it was wrong and then you corrected yourself. And I think this can help them maybe understand a little bit better how it's not just about getting better information and changing your mind.
Your old man took her diamonds and tiaras by the score. Now she gets her kicks in Stepney, not in Knightsbridge anymore. So don't play with me, 'cause you're playing with fire.
And even while you were talking, what's it been? 5-6 years since I deconverted, I guess. And I remember that what you were saying, where it's not just you believe something, but I felt like I believed things because I had to believe them, because I was supposed to believe them. So everything I believed, whether it was not just about God or Jesus Christ, or whether or not, I respect my parents, or I believe in the sanctity of marriage, or whether I love my country, or just everything, and even just simple things were not empirical truths to me. They were normative truths to me. They were more or less like, it's not just that this is right, it's right. And if you ask a question about it, you're wrong for questioning it because it's supposed to be right. And that's identity. And that was kind of where you started with this, right? Foreclosed identities.
Yeah, that's the whole point of the title of the talk is self-destruction, because it's literally about what is the self, what is the identity, and what's happening here to your identity. Yeah. And it has to do with how you construct your identity. And there are different ways to construct an identity. And when I was religious, I was constructing it based on one method of constructing it. And when I became secular, I reconstructed the identity, but in a different way. And that can be modeled and tested for, which is what's interesting. You can actually differentiate between these types of identities. And so this gave me finally something that said you did have like a different way of actually defining yourself as a Christian than you do now. And that's where the difference lies. And I think it's important because if you address yourself when you were a believer, if somebody would have said to you, you don't question and you don't have good reasons for what you believe, you would have really defended against that. Most people aren't going to say, oh yeah, you're right. You know, I really just believe for really don't have any reasons and it's just crap and I just believe it anyway. Very few Christians are going to come back with that, especially from authoritarian conservative brands of religion. They're going to be very defensive, saying, I have really good reasons for why I believe, and I really, really accept this as true, like to the core. And that's the thing about it. I mean, we define belief as acceptance of a proposition or acceptance of a claim as true. And I did hold it as true. It's not fair to say that I didn't believe it. I did believe it. So it's not a question of whether or not it was a belief or even a, quote, legitimate belief. It was. I believed it. I would have died for it. And so for me, I had to figure out, what was I saying then? Why do these beliefs feel different than these other beliefs to me from an internal perspective? I mean, don't you think that as a prior Christian, you would have been offended by someone suggesting that you didn't have good reasons for your beliefs?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, and yet you look back on it and you think, I had no good reasons for my beliefs. So the question becomes, how do you, I guess not the question of this presentation, but from an external perspective, when you're thinking about it, how do you relate to that person who's religious without just coming to them and throwing down that they have no good reason for their beliefs, which is going to result in nothing but defensiveness?
Yeah, it's like we want to throw facts at them. Well, you're wrong about this. Well, you're wrong about that. Was that peer reviewed? And bang, 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 and that doesn't work. That doesn't work.
It wouldn't have worked with me.
No, not me either.
So eventually I was able to see certain things where I believed these things and they contradicted my other beliefs. But ultimately I had to get but what deconverted me really isn't the focus of this talk. This talk is about how I am a really different person now because of how I come to my beliefs. Not because they weren't beliefs and these are beliefs, but because they're both beliefs, but I have a better way of coming to those beliefs, and there's a reason for that. And so that's kind of where this talk begins. And so I hear these comments from other people. They say things like, my mind just was not my own. It's as though those beliefs were not my beliefs. But then you ask yourself, whose beliefs were they? It was you and you believed it, right? So if your beliefs, if when you look at your beliefs now, you think these are my beliefs, but before what I had beliefs, but it didn't feel like they were mine. Not now, not in hindsight. It felt like they were mine at the time, but now I have this different view of it, and I don't look at those as legitimate anymore. And the question becomes, why? Like, what is it that the deconverted atheist is trying to communicate here? And that's what I'm hoping that I've found. People that aren't indoctrinated, some of the things I have in some of the slides were, they'll ask, like, how could you be so easily misled? Why didn't you see these obvious contradictions? Or they downplay it, like, we've all been wrong about things, or it's just the same as education. Indoctrination is no different than just being socialized or educated. And I'm going to put forward that I think they're very different things. We have intuitive thoughts that, if you get somebody when they're young or you tell somebody enough times, people hear this a lot, but what does it mean? What does it mean to say, get them when they're young enough or tell them enough times and they'll believe it? What are we really trying to get to when we say those types of intuitive things? It's almost like we observe it as humanity that this has an impact, that you can sort of get things in when someone's younger and it's easier to do. But what is the actual data behind that? And so I found this passage from an article that I came across. And I was very lucky to be able to get in touch with the author, even though the article was a fairly old article. It was 2004. And one of the quotes they had in there was that the patient belonged, they're talking about patients, and they were overseeing a group of, they were like a elder psychiatrist who was overseeing a group of younger interns that were working at a facility that was like a group facility for patients. And so this one patient, they said, belonged to a fairly strict church, believed strongly in his own sinfulness, and the dominant idea about identity for him seemed to be that his essential nature was no good and that he required ministrations of his church practice as a corrective measure so as to ensure his survival. His practical identity seemed to be mostly concerned about suppressing his natural identity, as if he perceived his natural identity to be sinful. And so you get into this idea of practical identity versus natural identity. And that's a kind of difficult concept. And in other models, it's called an organismic identity, or the idea that there's something about you that is inherently what you want or who you are. And then there is this capacity to suppress it. And I guess if you think about Freud's models, right, like you have the ego and the id and the superego. And so there's this idea that there might be things that you personally prefer or want, but then you also know that there's these expectations that you have to conform to. And so you tend to have a representative identity that you put out to other people that is somewhat reflective of who you actually are, but maybe you suppress some of who you are because you know it's not appropriate in certain situations. You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
Right. And so you can have small things like, I would really love to pig out right now, but I don't want to pig out in front of all these people. So I'm going to eat like a normal person and have a normal portion and whatnot. Maybe you conform to something that small.
I don't actually have that.
But then
resistance.
There's big things. But sometimes you can have huge things like I'm gay, but nobody can know it.
Right.
And that's a giant thing, right? That's a huge thing to have to suppress, because it's not like I need to suppress not just porking down this meal right now. I need to just, eat and act like a, like normal person. I can't just start grabbing and just shoving things down my throat and have five helpings or whatever I want. But when you're gay, you're suppressing something all the time, assuming that you're in this situation where somebody is telling you that you can't be gay. You're suppressing this all the time because it's an inherent part of who you are. And so there are these distinctions between what we present as identities to other people and what we have as an identity in ourselves, who we know as ourselves. And so there's actually these three different types of ways of looking at this. And I'm kind of jumping ahead a little in the slide presentation, but there are three ways of looking at ourselves. So there's our own view of ourself. There's how I see myself. And then there's this idea of how you see me, right? So you have a certain perspective of me and I have a perspective of me. But then I also have a perspective of your perspective of me, right? So, and that could be wrong. I might think that you don't like me, but really you do like me.
That's so true.
Right?
Yeah, there's me, then there's how you see me, and then there's how I think you see me. That
Correct.
Makes perfect sense, yeah.
Yeah. And all of these come into play when it comes to identity, right? Because we are conforming to all of that. There was this chart that I found. I don't know if it's a chart, but it's like this, if you picture like a cross with an X and Y axis. And on one axis, there's how committed you are to an idea. And on the other axis, there's how much you've explored it. Like how much have you researched it, looked into it. And so there's like 4 different quadrants that this makes when you make the cross. And what they're asking is, when it comes to something that identifies who you are, when you're picking this and saying, this is a value that I'm going to adopt for myself because I believe in this, there's a question of how committed are you to that value and how much do you really understand the value? How much research have you done into that value? And you can have not explored it very much and still be highly committed to it. I don't know much of, like, some people will express things that are very powerful opinions. You start asking them questions, you realize they don't know anything about it, but yet they have this very strong opinion about it. We've all seen that. That's not unusual.
Mostly with politics. Yeah, like somebody's super, super scared of the border caravan, right? And you start asking them, what are they afraid of? And they really don't, the things that they fear, you start looking it up and it's not true. It's an invasion, Tracie. It's an invasion. They're invading us.
This is the thing, though. When you start hearing what they're afraid of and you start actually looking up whether or not that's something to fear, you start to find that their fears don't correlate with research and reality, right? Are immigrants higher crime component than citizens? No. And that includes illegal immigrants or immigrants that are here undocumented. And so these things that they fear, you start realizing that they just fear it because someone told them to fear it. They didn't really look it up to see if it was an issue. And if they had, they would know that that's nothing to fear. So you could be really committed to an idea without having explored it, especially if somebody manipulates you because of fear or hate or something like that. If they can get you really riled up, you're going to get on board and before you're even thinking about what you're doing. And so then you can also have a situation where you've done not much exploration and you're really not committed to it. Like somebody who says, I really don't have an opinion on the border caravan. I don't know. It just doesn't matter to me. Haven't really looked into it, but I really don't care. There are people like that. And then you have a situation where there's high exploration, but low commitment. Like I research lots of stuff, but I'm not really going to commit to any of it. You know what I mean? It's like I study all the time. I research all the time, but I'm pretty flexible with all my values. And then there are people who have explored a lot and they're committed. And so they have a commitment. What's interesting is the people who have done more exploration and also have high commitment still tend to have lower commitment levels than people who have low exploration and high commitment. I found that to be an interesting
Wait. That flew right
statistic.
by me.
So basically, if you haven't explored much, but you're highly committed, you will rate yourself as more committed generally.
Oh, like a Dunning-Kruger thing, right?
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's kind of like that.
I don't know much about it, but I really, really believe it. And then there's other people who are like, I've really studied this and this is my belief on it, but they tend to still be more tentative. Like, this is my belief, but it's flexible, right? Like, it could change if there was better. Like, if the more you come to an understanding of an opinion or a value or a belief by research, the lower the commitment's going to be. Doesn't mean you won't have a high level of commitment. It just means it won't be as high as somebody who hasn't researched it, who is also highly committed, because you tend to understand that research can change your mind. So you're always kind of open to having your mind changed, which creates a more flexible commitment than the person who doesn't think research is what should make your committed attitude. Like
it kind of humbles you almost, because you have some bit of an understanding of how much you don't know. But whenever you're ignorant of just perfect example, my sister called me just the other day and she was talking about how, she just got her accounting degree, just got a new job in accounting, and how frustrated she is because so many people kind of think that they know what she does, and so many people she works with kind of think like, oh yeah, you just do this and you just do that, whatever, it's all debits and credits, and they just kind of blow it off. And she's like, it's kind of frustrating. I'm like, well, have you heard of Dunning-Kruger? And that's why it popped in my head, because it's so fresh. And she was like, well, what do you mean? I'm like, well, think about it. They think they know so much, like more than you, or at least equal to you, because they don't know enough to be humble. And she's like, oh my God, you're right. They're just stupid. I'm like, that's it. They're just stupid. But maybe it's a little more complicated than that.
Yeah. I mean, they don't understand how intricate and nuanced these opinions balance on, right? Like, so there's a pillar of nuance that a value can balance on, and they don't get that. They get that this is, like you were saying about your previous religious life, this is just a normative thing. This is just because it is. And that makes it solid. And when you know that it's not just because it is, it's because there's all these other factors that go into it. And there's some people that have this other opinion on it. We're not quite sure why this is, but there's this high correlation and blah, 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 blah. And ultimately you're just like, this is tentative. I believe it. I think I have a good reason for believing it. But I also know there's a lot of information that goes into that can shift. And so you're less committed, even though you still you're still committed. I don't want to make it sound like they're not committed. You're not committed at all. There's still high levels of commitment in both categories. But the one is based on low exploration, the other is based on high exploration. And I think ultimately that is the point, right? That's the difference between how the beliefs are achieved.
Ain't much I could do, but I do what I can. But I'm not a fool, there's no need to pretend. Just because you got yourself in some shit, it doesn't mean I have to come deal with it. You handle your own when you become a man. Become a man when you handle your own. Ain't much you can do, but I do what I can. But what can I do if I do till it's gone?
This is based on the work of James E. Marsha, who is a psychologist who came up with this model of identity development and also identity status. And the two identity statuses that are both important here would be the low exploration, high commitment, which is called foreclosed identity, and the high exploration, high commitment, which is called an achieved identity. Ultimately, the group that has the least amount of psychological problems and issues is going to be the achieved group. The group that puts a lot of energy into looking into the world around them and coming up with beliefs based on that. Those people tend to do better. And part of that has to do with flexibility, and we get into that a little bit more as well, because when you have this sort of foreclosed identity where you've got the high commitment but the low exploration, it also comes with its own unique set of problems. And that's the issue there.
Can you help me with one of the terms?
Yeah.
The achieved identity, I can kind of see in my head, like, you've achieved it. You've acquired this self-identity because you worked toward it. You earned it, more or less. Foreclosed, just as a like a vocabulary term, the first thing that pops in my head is, like a foreclosure on a house or something like that. Like, how does the term foreclosed identity relate?
Well, that's actually answered in the next slide slightly. Let me go through it and see if that helps.
I know.
So there's a quote at the beginning of the next slide, and it says, the variable of commitment cannot be the sole criterion for ego identity. So in other words, this is when Marsha was saying there's this commitment to identity, but there's more to it than that. He was understanding that there was another component, which of course is the research, is the exploration. So he says that the commitment can't be the sole criteria. The individual about to become a Methodist Republican farmer, like his Methodist Republican farmer father, with little or no thought in the matter, certainly cannot be said to have achieved an identity, the integrating, synthesizing activity of which Erickson, who's another researcher, speaks, seems not to have taken place. Hence, another criterion for the achievement of ego identity, in addition to commitment, is necessary: crisis. Crisis refers to times during adolescence when the individual seems to be actively involved in choosing among alternative occupations and beliefs. Commitment refers to the degree of personal investment the individual expresses in an occupation or belief. So what he's saying is the main difference between achieved and foreclosed is that one person has kind of at a point in their life, and when he says crisis, it's important. He doesn't mean something horrible. He means just the actual act of saying, this is what other people want me to be, but I have options, and let me examine those options and just see. And then later, if I come back and I say, I really like this Methodist Republican farmer thing, and I'm good with it, and I think that after examining my options, that's probably the way to go. But to just adopt it or accept all the reasons that people are giving you for why you should adopt it and not really put in the exploration to look at your options means that you have foreclosed on that identity. You've pretty much just boxed it and locked it down without really considering that that's what you wanted to do. It's like saying, I'm not gay, I'm getting married, I'm having kids, and yes, I struggle with these same-sex urges, but I'm not gay, right?
Right.
As opposed to being the person who says, I know that my church and my family don't want me to be gay, but I'm gay. That's the difference.
That makes sense.
And I had these little pictures, which I thought they were super cute, but I wish I had more super cute pictures, but it was like somebody digging in a sandbox. And it was talking about exploration, like digging in your little sandbox. And this is like when you're a Christian and you're thinking, I did explore my beliefs before I committed. Because that's what we would all say if we were raised in conservative Christianity. We would all say at the time we were a Christian, but I have explored before I committed and I looked into this. And it's this little sand kid digging in a sandbox. But then the next slide shows a giant backhoe that is digging up like an entire foundation for what looks like maybe a skyscraper. And what I put there was, or did I? Because once you start really looking at what it means to explore, what it means to put in the time to investigate your beliefs, to actually decide, okay, this is what I think about this. And when you realize the amount of effort and the amount of digging and how you have to really look at what other people are saying, people that you might intuitively disagree with, to actually just go in and say, but what is their argument? What is their concern here? And really examine that and consider it and ask yourself, am I giving this a fair hearing? And then finally saying, I think I really have valid reasons for what I believe, and what I'm adopting here as a value is so much more intense than what you did as a religious person that you previously defined as exploration. I mean, was that your experience as well?
Yeah, it's like you kind of touched on a nerve, like an emotional nerve just now, because I remember the wife and I, both atheists. I became an atheist before the wife did. My parents came to visit. My dad's Baptist minister, fundamentalist, you know, and mom's always been, you know, very fundamentalist Christian, and they come to visit. And typically we avoid topics that really get deep into religion, you know, unless it's, you know, like, okay, we're on the phone, let's debate this, Dad, you know, like we'll have those and we have fun with it, you know, and that's okay. I'm happy to say we have that kind of relationship, but we don't normally do like a one-on-one get into it because, for one, they live in Florida and I live in Texas, right? Mm-hmm. Also, it's just, we don't want to ruin the relationship. And I'm glad that they appreciate it to that level, that they don't want to ruin the relationship either. But this time it just happened. We went to church together, you know, the wife and I, and I brought my kids to all go to church. And then afterwards, there's just, you know, to be nice, to be polite, you know, it doesn't affect it. And it was fun because I got to like poke at the kids and be like, hey, look at those people crying over there. And we kind of giggled, you know, not disrespectfully, but just amongst ourselves, you know, kind of huddled around the hymnal. And
we respectfully laughed at the crying people.
We respectfully laughed at their pain of their fake hell. But anyway, we're sitting there and we're having a cup of coffee. It's like 2 a.m. and we are in it. I mean, the napkin has, you know, stuff written out in pen, and we're like tapping the napkin like, no, over here. You're over here. You need to get over here. It starts getting intense. And I remember saying, have you ever really wondered if there is a God? I mean, really wondered. And it started out with my dad going, of course I have. Of course I have. But by the end of it, I remember, I mean, hours in, my mom looking at me and going, why should we? And my dad being like, I don't need to ask those kind of questions. And we're like yelling. And it got so intense. And I remember my dad just looking at me and saying, you know what? I have made mistakes before because I question things I shouldn't question. And what if I question this and then I give up on God and what happens then? And I thought, oh my God, you know, like that, this is so intense. So I don't know. I kind of went off on a random rabbit trail there, but that's exactly
true. Like what you're saying is that ultimately what they finally admitted was that there's some parts of it they just don't question, and that's actually the
but they
point
think they do
graphic.
like the sandbox. They think they do, but they really haven't.
Right. The point of the sandbox isn't necessarily that it's not digging deeply. I mean, that's part of the analogy, but the other part of the analogy is that a sandbox has what? It has borders. You can't dig outside the sandbox. You go inside the sandbox and you can dig all you want inside the sandbox, but you don't dig outside the sandbox. There's certain things you can't ask.
That's so good, yeah.
And that's part of why I chose that. Instead of the backhoe can just dig up anything, right? Like you just dig anything. There's no boundaries on what you can ask once you're outside that religious structures. But then that's another part of the presentation was, how are those boundaries built? Because they don't, like you said, when you go to your dad initially and you say, have you ever questioned it? His first reaction is yes. But then by the time you get through the conversation, he's sitting there saying, why should I? And no. And it's bad to question, and it's scary to question, and you run into trouble if you start to doubt. And so you start to see that he is inside those boundaries, right? There's an outside to the boundary where you don't ask those questions, and there's an inside where you can dig all you want, right? And so when I went to church, you could dig all you want asking questions about God, but you didn't go outside that box and start asking if there's a God, or those are things you just didn't ask. You didn't have to, right? I mean, like you said, you knew there had to be a God, and so you just explored, what do other people believe about God? What do we believe about God? What is God like? Is this God's nature? You could ask all those questions and go as deep as you wanted to go, but you couldn't ask certain other things. And there's ways that they build those boundaries so that they're hard to see that you even have boundaries. And that's why so many of us are like, no, I did ask, and I did, it's like, because we didn't realize that there were walls around us. We thought we were going deep, maybe in a limited pool of information, but you couldn't go outside that information. But you didn't even realize that you couldn't. You just didn't. And sometimes you didn't even think about why or whether there was anything outside those walls. And that's a big part of it, getting people to not even see the walls. Inside the walls is all there is. It's all you need to deal with. And you think that anything outside those walls is unimportant. And that's how you think ultimately that you have researched this a lot more than you did. it's best to allow people to examine themselves. Like when you start telling people early on that there's something wrong with them and there's aspects of them that could potentially be unacceptable in a way that won't allow the person to look at themselves to try and decide what's best for themselves, that can be damaging to people. And we'll get into that in a little bit, but that's kind of also one of those ways that we build walls to keep people from asking questions. So the question that I had in my head was, I mean, I don't know about your experience, but when I was a Christian, I started thinking about, okay, so let's say I had a foreclosed identity. It's being defined by some psychologists is not flourishing. And so I started looking at it and I thought it looks a lot like an achieved identity. So in my case, I was a physically healthy person. I had good grades in school. I didn't really get in any kind of trouble with the cops. I was a pretty well-behaved kid. I was motivated by positive attention. If a teacher gave me positive attention, someone else gave me positive attention. I was very motivated to, get that. I wasn't like negatively motivated trying to get in trouble for attention or anything like that. I was generally well-liked. I had friends. I wasn't I wasn't horribly antisocial. I'm a little bit of an introvert. I guess I'm a lot of an introvert, but I still had friends.
Yeah.
I never had addiction problems. I didn't have any romantic relationships where I was ever physically abused or anything like that. And I went to college and did well, and I was a career-oriented person. So I'm looking at this list and I'm thinking, so where's the problem with the foreclosed identity? Because this sounds like the model citizen.
Yeah, it works.
Did it work for you like that?
No. Well,
okay. You had a different experience, which is fine.
I didn't feel like a winner. Like I feel like the way that you're describing, like you were very confident, and I was always aware, like I came off super confident. I was not an introvert. I was super extrovert my whole life, but I always knew my confidence was a total sham. Deep down, it was a little different back then for me than I guess it was for you, but I can totally relate, at least from the indoctrination perspective and how it wasn't really my own identity. I totally relate there.
Yeah. And so for me, this was the thing. So I had to look at this list and say, okay, so Dr. Dombeck, the author of the article, where's the problem with having a foreclosed identity if this can be who you are, if you're a good citizen? And so I asked him what were the negative effects, and he wrote me this back. He said, a person with foreclosed identity would be forever in a state of internal dissonance and would experience at some level, noticed consciously or not, internal conflict, stress, pain, and be very shame-prone. We would expect them to deny this vigorously, at least in public, but I would bet money it would be there. A modern successor to Rogers' work in acceptance and commitment therapy, Rogers is another psychologist, is acceptance and commitment theory, which discusses psychological flexibility as the core construct underlying whether psychopathology will be present or not. A person with foreclosed identity would not exhibit such flexibility and instead would be quite rigidly clinging to their introjected beliefs. There's a few new things introduced here, but the point is, when he said there would be this internal dissonance, internal conflict, internal stress, pain, shame, that's when I was like, holy cow, I had these issues as a Christian, and I didn't even recognize them as negative. So I might not have been the person who was gay and saying I'm not gay or I can't be gay, but I definitely was a human being. And rigid conservative Christianity, authoritarian Christianity, right, has this attitude that certain aspects of just the nature of human beings are sinful and wrong. And so all of that in me were things that I struggled with, right? So sexual issues, even if you're not gay, there's sexuality that happens to you as a young person before you're married or whatever. And even after you're married, right? Like marriage doesn't resolve it. You're still going to have issues even if you're married, and you're going to see people that you're attracted to, and there may or may not be rules between you and your spouse and how that gets dealt with. But in a Christian paradigm, there's a right way and a wrong way to do sex. And the right way to do sex under this authoritarian Christian mindset is kind of not aligned with how human beings actually are sexually oriented. And there's other things as well, but that would be part of it, right? So there are a lot of things that Christianity basically tells you are evil about yourself from an inherent natural perspective, that humans just are flawed. And here's why. And then they list all these things that are just normal to humans that have evolved. And you are told to condemn those things and suppress them. And that's what I was doing. Did you have the same experience?
Definitely with the like a shame-based sense of sexuality. Mm-hmm. And it was so weird because it wasn't, I like how you said marriage doesn't just fix that, especially not this religious, cultural kind of Western civilization marriage that we have, where like it wasn't until our early 30s that the wife and I both started really talking about how shame-based our sexuality was and how much we wanted to control the other person. And we were taught that's totally okay. That's totally normal. Of course you're supposed to control them. You own them. Yeah. They're yours till death do you part. And we really started asking some tough questions. And, sometimes those questions hurt. Sometimes you hear what your partner really thinks and you go, oh. And sometimes you got to say stuff that you don't want to hurt, but you want to be honest. And we really, I totally relate to that.
Yeah, I think my attitudes on sexuality would be like a whole other 10 hours. But that's a huge one, right? And you're right. They teach you that you should basically, if someone loves you, then they will just, basically turn over control of their sexuality to you, which is to me a disgusting concept. But I think
it just doesn't work. It's not realistic. Yeah.
It's not realistic, but it's also cruel and it's messed up. I mean, if somebody came to me and said, I will never have sex with anyone else again except for you because I love you so much, I would be like, you really don't have to do that. Like, it's cool. You can actually, I'm secure enough that I believe that you really like me, even if you don't like stop being with anybody else ever. Like, you don't need to cut off your arm for me.
Right.
And cutting off your sexuality is like cutting off an arm. I mean, people are sexual creatures. And the fact that people get married and they still like to look at porn, and that like 70% of guys that are married say they would have an affair if they thought they could get away with it and it wouldn't cause a problem, and something like 65% of women. I mean, we are not geared toward this. But all of our relational models are based on really messed up Christian models that people don't conform to. And it's funny because the same people who are looking at other men and women in pornography online are the same people who will sit there and battle, defiantly that they prefer monogamy and they don't want their partner to go and sleep with anyone else. And it's like, and yet you're sitting here basically looking at other people because that's what you're interested in.
Right. Well, I want the rules to ridiculous. Work for you, not for me.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's just, to me, such a, I don't know, it's like you say, it's about ownership and control and insecurity. And somehow if this person, swears off every other person but me, then I'll feel secure and then I'll be okay. And I had somebody write to me that one time where they said that they had issues with jealousy, but they had gotten over them with their partner. And I pointed out that getting to a point where you believe that you have 100% sexual control of your partner isn't really dealing with your jealousy, right? Saying, I don't trust you and I think you're sleeping with other people, and then saying, I finally reached a point where I trust you and I know that I control your sexuality and you're not sleeping with other people, isn't really you dealing with your jealousy. It's you just making someone else conform in a way that you don't care what they want or what would make them happy. You just want to know that you've got that locked down. And that's not controlling your jealousy. Controlling your jealousy is when your wife comes home after having sex with her boyfriend in another house and you are cool with it. That's controlling your jealousy.
That would certainly be a high level of control of jealousy if you're non-monogamous.
Yeah, and I think that's funny that it's interesting to me. Like, I noticed that when people say if someone says they're polyamorous, right? Like we kind of look at that like they're expressing for themselves that they are attracted to many people, or that they can be affectionately bonded with many people, that they can have multiple partners and that they're comfortable with that. But when someone says I'm monogamous, we almost inherently apply that to their partner as well.
Oh, that's
so.
A good
in other
point.
words, I only want to be with one person, but I'm also going to demand that the person that I'm with has to only be with me. And it's like, wow, if you were going with a polyamorous partner, would you be okay if they said that they need you to sleep with lots of other partners in order to be acceptable to them? I mean, applying that to someone else is so weird. I almost think there needs to be a different language set up where we have one set of labels for the internal state of monogamy and another for like the idea of a relational outside situation where two people never ever have sex with anyone else. Because you can have non-monogamous people who are in a relationship where they only have sex with each other, but they are not monogamous people. They are in a monogamous relationship, but one of them's online watching porn all the time, so that's not a monogamous person. That's a person who wants to have sex with other people, that gets turned on by other people, that likes watching other people having sex, and they would probably be okay with having sex with other partners if it wouldn't wreck their marriage.
Wouldn't it make you cringe a little bit, though, if, like, let's say you're out at, like, some social function or something, and a couple comes up, and the guy goes, "I'm polyamorous," and the wife is kind of hugging on his arm, and she says, "Well, I'm monogamous." Would you kind of be like, "Are you sure?"
No, I've actually met couples like that, right? So
really, it wasn't weird.
There's a guy that I met who his wife doesn't really want to be with anybody else. She's happy in the marriage. She has male friends and things, but she's not interested in sexuality with anybody but her husband. But she's completely okay with him going out and having girlfriends and sleeping with them. So he's very much polyamorous, but she is monogamous. Now, the thing is, when you look at the relationship, you have to ask, how do we define that? Are they in a monogamous relationship? And I look at it like, well, she is, but he's not. It gets a little tough to define, because when a person says I'm in a monogamous relationship, we tend to think both partners are monogamous. But we're assuming that. And I think there needs to be broader language or better labels for this, because there's too many things that aren't actually explained through those labels. I
had a guy tell me that. He said, "Yeah, I sleep around, but the wife doesn't." And I thought, either you're lying or she is. But I didn't buy it. I didn't buy it.
And there, like, for example, there are some men who really, really think their partners are sexy, and they get turned on watching their partner with other men. So there are guys who are like, "No, man, that's just the one woman that really turns me on. And it really turns me on to see other men like her, because I know that's how hot she is." I mean, I've seen that situation too.
Sure, that makes sense.
So, I mean, it goes either way. You can have, a person that's really into one person, and then they're okay with that person having sex with other people. Often, people who are poly don't really care if their partner is sleeping with multiple people or not. They're not going to make somebody go out and have sex. There are people that pressure their partners, and that's wrong. It's definitely wrong to try and pressure a partner to have sex with anybody that they don't want to. It's also wrong, I think just as wrong, to try and pressure somebody to not have sex with people if that's who they are.
But
I think that we're not at a place where we're ready to really be honest with ourselves as a society about it. I mean, there are way more people who want to have sex with more people than their partner, that if it was socially acceptable, if we just could strip all the stigmas off of it, and if it wasn't going to destroy relationships and everybody would be cool about it, I think there'd be a lot more sex between a lot more people.
It's an interesting point. I've never considered that, where you would say where forcing someone into monogamy is equally reprehensible as a polyamorous person forcing someone out of monogamy, perhaps. That's an interesting comparison there.
I think either way, you're not respecting the person's sexuality.
Right.
You're denying an aspect of who they are that is, like, so deeply inherent to them that it's, to me, that's the reprehensible part of it. It's absolutely disrespecting someone's agency.
It's still control either way. You're still trying to control them. And somehow you feel like that's going to make everything work out for you. And like you said earlier, I dealt with my jealousy because I controlled the person. And it's
I finally realized that I absolutely have 100% control over them. And now I feel better.
That's funny. In a lot of ways, it's kind of like whenever you say, look at how good I am at this marriage. They're twisting their ability to control their partner, and that their partner's trying to control them, but both are being dishonest to one another, about infidelity or about pornography or about just their own desires, what have you. But they almost twist that into a good thing to say, but look, the marriage is working. And it's like, but is it,
Yeah. And that was one of the slides, is fundamentalists translating that sort of denial, right? Or what we were talking about, the internal conflict, stress and pain, and that shame. When you're a fundamentalist Christian, that's looked at as a positive state of being. So you're taking what is a psychopathology and you're basically relabeling it and repackaging it as something good, and saying that this is how you recognize your inherent human failings. And then you fall into this fail forgiveness cycle where I fail and then I have to go get forgiveness. And now we're back to that original patient, how he felt like he was this horrible, sinful thing. And he always needed the forgiveness and the ministrations of his church to make it better. And he kept going back and he couldn't get out of that cycle. But that's the whole reason that you stay in church, right? You're motivated to try harder to reach this perfect, unachievable, Christ-like state. And it leads to shame and guilt because you can never reach that, right? So you're in this marriage where you're not supposed to want to sleep with anybody else, and yet you really want to watch pornography, or you really like that model in that commercial or in that ad, that woman was so pretty, or that man was so attractive, or whatever the situation is, and then you feel bad because you're not supposed to have those feelings, which are completely normal feelings. So what they do is they just say your natural identity is what you shouldn't be, and you need to be ashamed of it, and you need to try not to be that. You can never not be that because that's who you are. And then you go through this cycle of failing and then having to go and ask for forgiveness because you're human. And that shame and guilt and self-dissatisfaction triggers all that prayer and need for forgiveness and your sense of being imperfect and inherently depraved and how you need help to do better. And then you feel all gratitude for how you can be forgiven for being a human being. And then you also, as a Christian, have judgment on those who don't have that experience, right? So when you hear about people who are like, I don't need to be forgiven, like I'm okay with my sexuality, and you just think, oh, those people are sinful and callous and shameless, and they're not willing to correct their sinful behavior. And so you actually sometimes feel sorry for them, and you think that you feel bad for people who aren't busy suppressing themselves all the time. Wow. Even though you're the one that you should be feeling bad for, because you're the person who has all these negative views about who you are that are completely unmerited.
That's so true.
Yeah.
That was just a dream. That was just a dream. That's me in the corner. That's me in the spotlight, losing my religion, trying to keep up with you, and I don't know if I can do it. I'm now said too much. I haven't said enough. I thought that I heard you laughing. I thought that I heard you sing. I think I thought I saw you try. But that was just a dream. Try, cry, why, try. That was just a dream. Just a dream. Just a dream.
And I guess we probably don't have time to get through the different ways that people block their, build their borders around their sandbox. But there's all kinds of things that are done there, like blaming, making people feel blame, and sort of telling them that they're threatening them with hell or whatever, tell them that this or that is Satan's influence, and kind of keeping people from going certain places, telling them to distrust science, for example, right? So you start undermining science education and saying that evolution is crap, and saying that, realities about sexuality is garbage. And so you start telling them early on that not to trust science, right? That science has flaws. And you even use like science self-correcting nature to show that it's imperfect, right? That you can't trust it because it's wrong about these things. But basically, you point to where it corrects itself, which is a good thing, and say this is why it should not be trusted. And so there's all these you undermine other religions as well, right? So they tell just untruths and lies about other religions. I was told that Buddhists worship Buddha, which they don't. And
I was too. Yeah.
And so they tell you all these things almost like an inoculation, like we're going to teach you about this. And that way you understand about Buddhism and you don't have to go look it up for yourself. But if you do start looking this stuff up, if you do start doing further reading and you start seeing that they've got it wrong, and then you go and talk to them and they start telling you that you shouldn't be looking it up, right? I mean, but this is how they this is ways that they build the sandbox boundaries, by telling you things before you encounter them that make you have an inherent distrust of other religious ideologies, other methodologies of discerning truth. They just go and attack those things early on to start building those walls so that you feel like you don't need to go out of those walls. And so you start doing all of your research through these apologists, right? Like apologists who are talking about science, and you're looking at all the science, the skeptical of science sites, and that's sort of your research. And you think you're digging, but you're digging within the sandbox. You're not digging outside. You're not saying, well, what do the scientists actually say?
Fascinating. Yeah, I remember it's not just, at least in Christian schools, it wasn't just like, oh, these other religions believe things that, they don't really believe. Like you were saying, Buddhists worship Buddha, or I think at one point on your talk, it was Catholics are idol worshipers. They worship Mary.
I mean, yes, they have like a great reverence for the saints and for Mary and all, but they definitely would say that they're monotheistic, right? I mean, they view themselves as monotheists.
Yeah, of course. But it was also like in just studying basic stuff like history or even in literature. I remember that we would talk about Henry David Thoreau and we'd go over like all his different ideas and that sort of thing. And then they'd say something like, oh, but he was gay. And it was like, what? What does that have to do with anything? Like, but it would almost be like, let's discount anything he might have said because he was just a sinner that wanted to live in his sin, or some kind of like cliche thing like that.
I had a friend who was raised in religion, and we had a mutual gay friend, and every time they would talk about them, and they were both of our friends, it wasn't like they didn't like them.
Right.
So the religious friend, every time they would say something about the gay friend, they would say, yeah, I don't agree with this lifestyle, but, and then they'd say the compliment. And they did this like all the time. And finally, I stopped him one day and I said, do you realize that what you do there? Like, do you realize that you can't ever say a nice thing about our gay friend without saying, I don't agree with this lifestyle, but, and then saying how great he is? I'm like, do you do that with other things? Like we have other people that we know that smoke, for example. And I never hear you say, I think smoking is really unhealthy, but they're a really honest person.
Yeah.
You don't pull out like what you consider to be a problem between you and them and the ideologies that you don't share, or the values or the inherent things that you don't share. You don't always list the things you disagree with about a person's lifestyle before you start talking about them. That's a weird thing to do.
So true.
There was a couple other things I wanted to hit on if we can just go over maybe a little bit. There was the concept of introjection, because I mentioned it and I'd just like to define it. So introjection has to do with what we talked about earlier, where I have an idea of what you think of me. And when you catch somebody as young like a child, they can be resilient to that kind of criticism if it's infrequent. But when you start to tell them that over and over again repeatedly as they're getting older, they start to adopt that as a view. The problem is, though, it's a view that you gave them, that they internalize, but it's still your view, right? So they're grabbing this as this is how people see me, and then they internalize it, but it's not their own inherent view of themselves. It's an identity aspect that you actually put into the person by making them think that this is how people see them at an age where they don't have any real defense against it. If you tell somebody who's highly competent, you never do anything right, they're just going to laugh. But you tell that to a child who has built no identity, right? They don't really have this defense of, I know I'm competent, or I have faith in my abilities. So when you start telling them over and over again, they never do anything right, especially as a caregiver, they start to adopt that and they start taking it on. So you have a concept that a lot of people are familiar with that's called projection.
Yeah.
And that's when you take your ideas and you put it onto someone else. And introjection is when you start taking on someone else's view of you. So you basically adopt that view that they're giving you of you. And it's easy to do to children, and it's damaging if you put too much negative on them. And the other thing was about flexibility and why that's important. There was another little chart, had lots of components to it. I won't get into it too much, but if anybody wants to read about it, it's a structural analysis of social behavior, or SASB. And you can look that up, but it has to do with flexibility and emotional flexibility. And it has basically four, it's like think of a rectangle with four sides, and one would be freedom, and one would be control, and one would be love, and one would be attack. And the idea is that all of these things are necessary to have a healthy identity, to be a healthy person. I have to be able to free myself from suppression at times when it's beneficial to me, at times when that would be the healthy thing to do. Sometimes someone's trying to suppress you, and the right thing to do is to not allow that. Sometimes, though, you have to suppress yourself, right? Sometimes there are things where you might want to do or say a thing, and you just think, I better not do or say that right now. And then later you're glad you didn't do or say it because it was the best thing. So you have to be able to control yourself, but you also have to be able to free yourself. And you have to be able to love yourself for the things that you think are worthy. And then you also have to be able to attack yourself. Attack here is used in sort of a hyperbolic way. They just mean you have to be able to take the blame for things that you are actually blameworthy for, things that are actually your fault. You need to be able to acknowledge that, to admit it, to step up and let people know, hey, I'm sorry I did this. So there are times when you want to blame yourself. There's times when you want to affirm yourself. There's times when you want to free yourself, and times when you want to suppress yourself. All of that you have to be able to do in order to be a healthy person. If you end up unable to do any of those things, that's the inflexibility, when a person gets stuck in a particular area of that and they can't. For example, they love themselves all the time, even when they do things that are bad. Well, that's not good. And that's going to lead to psychopathologies. And it's the same if you attack yourself all the time, even though there's good things about you. That's not healthy either. If you're constantly suppressing things about you that really are not things that you should be suppressing, that can cause you harm. And when you free yourself to do whatever without any kind of consideration for anyone else, we kind of tend to see that as sort of not so okay. So there's a flexibility there where you should be able to do all of these things to a reasonable extent, and you should live somewhere in the middle of them where you can access any of them at any time. When people start to inhabit a space that's in the corners of this rectangle, then they start becoming what they call inflexible. That is, you can't express some of these things, and that's what causes psychopathologies. Inflexibility is highly correlated with psychopathology and other diagnosed mental illness issues. And so that was kind of an important thing too. And the religious upbringing from the authoritarian religions actually do encourage inflexibility in a lot of ways, which would be another part of this presentation. But I see I've got so much information, I have to cut this down. That's what's killing me. I've got to cut some of it out. I'm not sure how.
It's hard to do. It's all so applicable.
And it's also interconnected.
Yes. And one thing that you had mentioned about saying like giving, what was the term you used whenever you it's not just indoctrinating a child with religion, but you said you kind of indoctrinate them about like almost feeling bad about themselves in a sense. What was that? Well,
introjection is when you're telling them,
Yes, introjection, that's where I'm taking on all your cathartic junk you're giving to me, right? In a sense.
Or I guess the non-cathartic, right? It's like it's not very cathartic at all. It's really painful and causes you lots of stress and you get all dissonant inside.
Yeah. I remember growing up, that was one thing I was always taught was I can't do good. They would always say, Robert, there is no good that you can do. Only God does good through you. So if you let God do good, whatever good you do, that's just God doing it. You can only do evil inherently. So, I mean, that was just always drilled in my head so often. And I remember the first time I tried drugs, I was like, wow, this is pretty awesome. I think I'm just going to do this all the time. And I totally got hooked on cocaine for like a long time.
Yeah.
And, I'm not trying to make a joke because I know some people, they generally have struggles with that. And I'm glad I got out of that. But still, I mean, it's almost funny in a sense of saying like, as if you could just look back at those preachers, at your parents, at maybe if you went to a Christian education, those teachers and administrators, if you could just look back at them and go, well, you said I was a piece of shit, so I'm just going to get hooked on drugs. And that was kind of my experience.
That's kind of what your dad was talking about, though, right? And that's a whole other issue. But when people are raised in religion, because you're not given those options and you're not encouraged to look at options, you don't really have any other foundation to navigate your life other than the religious indoctrination that you've just endured. And so if you try to get away from it, it's almost a recipe for failure, because the idea that you're going to just sort of luck out and navigate something as complex as life without any critical thinking skills or being taught, how to do this in a responsible way and being told you just follow these rules. So like you're saying, what if you had been raised by parents who said, drugs are not like the be all end all of evil. They make you feel good. That's why people do them. Right. But you have to be careful, because sometimes people get, hooked on drugs, and some drugs can lead to situations where you might actually end up in trouble with them, because some people like that good feeling so much that they have difficulty, stopping the drugs, or they might spend all their money on drugs. And so you have to take some care. And if you're going to dabble in drugs, you need to be somewhat responsible and aware that if something starts to be something that appeals to you too much, you might want to be careful with that. I mean, what if they had taught you literally, like, here's the honest take on it. It's just kind of like alcohol, but on steroids. And instead of saying it's just evil, don't do it, and you won't have a problem.
Yeah, that would have saved me like a whole year of life. right there. Just that little tidbit would have been useful. But at the same time,
and that's the thing though. If you don't give, and so what your dad is saying is, I got out of when I started to doubt, when I started to try things without the religion, I really regretted it, and I went back to the religion. Lots of people have that experience. I had that experience. When I became, I guess, a member of the church, it was because I had sort of gotten out of it for a few years and life just wasn't working for me. But I didn't know anything. Right. And I just kept praying to God to help me and give me a sign, what am I, show me that you exist and stuff. That was like the 2 years of begging God to give me a sign.
Oh, I went through that too. I went
not
through that
knowing
too.
how to live.
Totally. Yeah, just
and then when I went back, I was so committed, right? Because things were so much better because now I had the answers again in front of me. And I just had to put my nose to the grindstone and just follow those bullet points, and my life would be fine. Except that what I was, now what I'm seeing is my life would have been full of dissonance, would have been full of shame, would have been full of internal conflicts, and constantly suppressing and chastising myself for being a human being. I would have just been forever in that state of internal dissonance that the psychologist was telling me about earlier.
That's awesome. I have thoroughly enjoyed this, and you gave me a lot to think about. I think you gave the listener a lot to think about too. And I hope so. Yeah, I really appreciate this. Tracie, if people wanted to learn more about this topic, what would you recommend?
I think the best way to do that would be to just go and look up some of these things on identity development, and that would be what to look for. I think I gave the SASB model, just look up structural analysis, SASB, and you'll get some articles on that. And you can also get articles on James Marcia. And I will say that James Marcia's models were tweaked a bit. They're kind of older. They're from the 60s, and they did get tweaked, but they're still, they're still basically the foundation of how this stuff works and how it's interpreted. Just little tweaks. Like, for example, he was saying that you go through this crisis in adolescence, and what they found was you could actually go through that crisis at any time, or even have multiple crises through your life, right? Anytime your identity is challenged in a way that makes you kind of rethink it, that would constitute a crisis. So little things like going through it in a linear fashion. They were like, sometimes you don't go through this in a linear way. Sometimes you bounce back and forth through the phases, stuff like that. But his basic model is still held to be, the foundation of identity development in psychology.
And in the naked light I saw 10,000 people, maybe more. People talking without speaking. People hearing without listening.
I think if people want to see some of the content from the atheist community of Austin, they do have a webpage, and I know the Atheist Experience has a YouTube channel. We also do a show called Talk Heathen. I think we do one called Parenting Beyond Belief for secular parenting. There's another one called, I think it's Sex and Sexuality, or Secular Sexuality.
Yeah,
and then
you guys took over.
Godless Bitches, Nonprofits. There are tons and tons of shows. There's a few more. They do a round table and some other things. So just look up Atheist Community of Austin. Look for that content. If you're interested in programming, if you're looking for podcasts, there's tons of it through that particular group.
So cool. So cool. Thank you, Tracie, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Of silence, and the people bowed and prayed to the neon god they made.
Thank you for listening. Thank you also to Dave Blair at davefreesong.com/free music. Thank you to our patrons. You can learn more at therighttoreason.com. Next week, we're debating the Illuminati. Really this time. You're ready for that. I want to thank Tracie Harris for being courageous and speaking out against the bigotry of religion today. I think Anthony said it best in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar when he said, "Blood and destruction shall be so in use, and dreadful objects so familiar, that mothers shall but smile when they behold their infants quartered with the hands of war, all pity choked with customs of fell deeds, and Caesar's spirit raging for revenge. With 8 by his side, come hot from hell, shall in these confines the monarch's voice cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war." You must speak out this season at the Christmas dinner table, in your workplace, to your friends. Call or write your congressman. Get crazy to anyone that'll listen. Tell them you're an atheist. Tell them you're proud. Tell them we matter. Proclaim to the world that we have a voice. Force your fist of truth down the fucking gullet of everyone you can. You have the right to reason, and you have the goddamn duty to get loud. Break something, and don't be silent.
And in the naked light I saw,
Don't be silent.
10,000 people, maybe more.
Don't be silent.
People talking without speaking.
Don't be silent.
People hearing without listening.
Don't do it.
Writing songs that voices never share.
Don't fucking dare.
And no one dares
Don't be silent.
disturb the sound of silence.
No te quedes callado.
Said I, you do not know.
We need your help.
It's like a cancer growth.
Don't be silent.
Hear my words and I might teach you.
Don't be silent.
Take my arms and I might reach you. But my words, like silent raindrops fell, and echoed in the wells of silence.
The argument with faith is the foundation and origin of all arguments because it is the beginning, but not the end of all arguments about philosophy, science, history, and human nature. It is also the beginning, but also by no means the end of all disputes about the good life and the just city. Religious faith is precisely because we are still evolving creatures, ineradicable. It will never die out, or at least not until we get over our fear of death and of the dark and of the unknown and of each other. For this reason, I would not prohibit it, even if I could. Very generous of me, you might say, but will the religious grant me the same indulgence? I ask because there is a real and serious difference between me and my religious friends, and the real and serious friends are sufficiently honest to admit it. I would be quite content to go to their children's bar mitzvahs, to marvel at their Gothic cathedrals, to respect their belief in the Quran and how it was dictated, though exclusively in Arabic, to the illiterate merchant, or to interest myself in Wicca and Hindu and Jain consolations. And as it happens, I will continue to do this without insisting on the polite reciprocal condition, which is that they, in turn, leave me alone. But this, religion is ultimately incapable of doing. As I write these words, and as you read them, people of faith are in their different ways planning your and my destruction, and the destruction of all hard-won human attainments that I have touched upon. Religion poisons everything. Christopher Hitchens, God is not great.
And the people bowed in praise to the neon god they made. And the sign flashed out his warning, and the words that it was forming. And the sign said the words of the prophets are written on the subway walls, and tenement halls, and whispered in the sound of silence.
End the silence and support the Right to Reason podcast at patreon.com/right.